Hello YouTubers again. Yes, I wanted to post this video today to do a talk briefly about Israel and my thoughts about it. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about over the last few months, and in fact on and off for some years. In fact, I think it's something that we're all concerned about. It's a situation that often makes the news. You often hear about this ongoing conflict, and everyone's got their different thoughts on it, and it's something that I think it's really important because of its strategic placement, politically and geographically, of course. It's in that central point where three continents meet. It's referred to here as the Middle East, but as somebody recently said to me, that's a Western term, in fact. So it's orientated as a perspective from the West. People east of the Middle East don't really call it that, of course. Anyone in the Asian subcontinent. So, of course, I'll just refer to it as the Arabian Peninsula. But even that, of course, is a loaded term, I suppose. So whatever you give the area a name, of course, has a particular meaning to it. Some people look at it as Judea, of course, which was the ancient Roman province. But of course, there's different names for that area, and Israel, of course, was the ancient name for the Jews that lived there. But that's thousands and thousands of years ago, in fact. So modern Israel, of course, came about in the 1940s. It was legally recognised. And the reasons for creating a modern state of Israel were two, as far as I can see. The chief reason seemed to be, at the time, to escape persecution. Of course, we're all quite familiar with stories of the genocide that happened. It's alleged that up to 6 million Jews died during the Second World War, during the Holocaust. We probably won't know the true figure, of course, since the Nazis were destroying bodies and evidence. So we're really not quite sure on the total numbers. But there was persecution throughout Europe, and so it was quite fair and understandable that many people wanted a safe and secure place where they would be free from persecution. And in fact, historically, there'd been a lot of persecution in Europe going back many hundreds of years, and in fact, throughout the centuries. That had varied considerably. It wasn't continuing throughout the whole time, but there were certain various periods where it got worse. And in fact, there were Jews scattered throughout the whole region. You'll find many different tribes of Jewish ancestry throughout different parts of Africa and throughout the Arabian Peninsula, and even further afield. Even in Iran today, you'll find many Sephardic Jews that have lived there for longer than they would even know, centuries. So there were scattered diaspora of Jewish remnants that live throughout the world, but they wanted an area to call their own and to be safe and secure and free from the persecution, which was really worse in Europe. That's where it sort of got to a climax with the Nazis' persecution of them and the genocide that took place. So that was the number one reason at that time, that there was a desperate search for that. But predating that, long before that, there had always, or for a long time, been a Zionist agenda to take back control of that region within the Middle East and to reclaim the ancestral land. So that brings me on to the secondary reason, and that of taking back what is alleged to be promised land to them. And there's all various scriptures within the Torah, or what's known to some as the Old Testament first 5 books, which are the books of law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so there's various other scriptural passages also quoted, giving reference to the reason for them wanting that area of land. They use that scriptural evidence to justify that, saying that God had promised them that land, and that is the home of the Jews, and that's land that was given to them, bequeathed to them by God, in fact. So the Jews had a divine part of the plan to uphold and to reveal God's laws. and for example, Moses, the lawgiver, and all the other prophets, of course. But the Jews have a very long and colourful history in terms of their relationship with other cultures, and also in terms of their relationship to God. But it is a core belief of many Jews that that is their ancestral homeland, and they feel a sacred connection to that through their ancestors, but much more than through their blood ancestors, also through their teachings, through their scriptures, and through that kind of belief within that, that is their divine homeland, and that God had promised them the right to return. So the right to return, I think it's called Aliyah. The Jews, or various people that are descendants of Jews at least, they claim their right to return based on that. And so there were those two reasons. There was the fear of persecution and the wanting a safe place to be secure. And also the secondary reason, that it's their homeland and it's been divinely promised to them. In fact, there are a whole wealth of different scriptures making all sorts of different promises. And in fact, it's quite hard to sort of go into and debate those. That would be a slightly separate issue than this. But I think it's a worthwhile pursuit to look into for those interested. There's a whole range of different scriptures and scriptural justification for that. There's also a lot of debate and room for debating within those issues as to whether it is the promised homeland for them to be there and whether they should all be recalled to that area. But I think my thoughts on that is that if you use that as your justification, that it is your homeland and that God has divinely ordained that, then you've got to live up to that. That's the thing about having that as a reason. If that's your justification, then you have to be held accountable to those standards. You can't say you've got a special mission by God, and then when you go to the place to do that, you don't live by those standards of God. You have to be seen to be doing that. So in actual fact, that's actually my issue, I think, with that. Is that I think in terms of the Mosaic laws, which I think are the most sacred and the profound laws, and I think even mainstream Judaism would consider those the fundamental importance, the ones to only worship God, not to have any idol worship, not to blaspheme, to keep the Sabbath holy, not to steal, not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to covet thy neighbour's things. So those would be, and the others, those would be really the sacred 10 commandments that were given to Moses. And of course, there's various other things as well as that Jews would hold as sacred too. There's various other Levitical laws, for example, and there's various other teachings, Talmudic teachings throughout the centuries that have added to those. But the most essential, the most fundamental teachings are the Mosaic laws, the 10 commandments. So you couldn't really argue, for example, that you wanted to be there in the Holy Lands as a representative of God, and that you were there as a fulfillment of a divine promise by God, and not be held accountable to those Mosaic 10 commandments. They must be a central part, if that is your claim to a right over that land. And I think that's my major issue with that, in fact, whether or not they are going to be held accountable to that. To be honest with you, in terms of looking at the commandments, we all fall foul of those. Nobody keeps them all of the time. So we all make mistakes or do things purposefully, selfishly, on purpose sometimes, you know, even if it's not committing full-blown adultery, you know, we may engage in some sort of relationship behind our partner's back. We may indulge in a kiss. You know, we may not go as far as murdering someone, but we may hit them or slander them, you know, or we may not steal their life savings, but we might steal something from them. Yeah. So there's different degrees. The law isn't necessarily either you've totally kept it or totally haven't. There's different degrees of severity within that. There's small law breakings, medium-sized law breakings, and very major law breakings, which would include the murder of somebody, for example. So so in terms of judging people for being not keeping the whole of the law, well, none of us do. We all fall short of the glory of God. That is to say, nobody's perfect all of the time, And I think if you believe in God or not, I think everyone would agree to that. And obviously, not everyone agrees with those moral standards. But if you are saying that you have a divine right to that ancestral homeland from God, and one of your key revelations from God is the Mosaic 10 Commandments, you would expect to be held accountable to those standards. And whilst you wouldn't expect someone to be completely perfect in every way and blameless and totally innocent, nobody is as an adult, you would expect them to have some degree of understanding and following the law. And in as much a way as if somebody is a police officer or a judge and they have a legislative role in life, it would be all the more shocking if they weren't living a legal lifestyle. That would be something contradicting the very teaching that they are supposedly living by. So in terms of whether or not Israel and the Jewish populace as a whole are living by those 10 Commandments, it's quite hard to sort of decide that for the simple reason that there's a whole population of millions of people there, and who could know what millions of people are up to? I think it's something like 6 million Jewish people that are living in that area. And strangely enough, about 20% of them claim to be atheists now. So I suppose the atheists, I suppose they don't believe in any homeland promised by God, or by point of logic that they don't believe in God. There can't be a promise from God if you don't believe in God. So their basis for claiming right on their land there, I suppose, comes down to wanting a safe and secure place, which we would all like, and countless other tribes who've been persecuted probably would have liked to, like the Aboriginals. They too would have liked their own rights and their own land and protection of that too. And it's a good reason why everyone would want that, to be sure. But the other reason they might still claim, atheists, Israeli atheists, they might still claim a legitimacy because of their ancestral roots. Well, so too would Aboriginals as well. There's Aboriginals that have lived in Australia or America for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's their ancestral land, and they had a connection to the land. They worked the land. Their ancestors did through generations. And yet, of course, many of them were forcibly or coercively moved from the land in any case. But, that doesn't make it right or anything, but it just means, it's a global situation. But I think the legitimacy of having a land that you can go back to, that your ancestors lived on thousands of years ago, I think that if that is your sole claim, that is a farce in a way. You can't have that as a claim. If that was the claim, then the Celts would have a good right to come back in England, and Wales and Ireland and Scotland could have a union and take over England, couldn't they? They would have a legitimate claim because hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, this was a Celtic land before the Romans came here, the Anglo-Saxons, and then the Norman invasion, and then many others since then have come here. Who on earth? And that's just one area. You could go around the world saying all sorts, couldn't you, about different people staking different claims to different areas based on things hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. So I think if you're an atheist Israeli, I think your claim rests solely on wanting somewhere safe and somewhere secure. And of course, you want somewhere where other people that speak the same language and have a similar culture gathered close to you, sure. But that, of course, is what many other Aboriginals would like to, and yet are denied the rights to as well. And that is what many people would like, in fact, in life. So, I think I can see their understanding. I can see that they would have a wish for that. But, I don't see that as that as the strong basis for a justification, really. But nevertheless, a lot of the people in Israel, of course, they didn't necessarily move there, they were born there. So, because it was 1940s, the creation of the State of Israel, we're now looking at second, third, and in some cases fourth generations that are being born there. So the fact of being born into a country means you do have a right to be there, of course. I feel I've got a right to be here because I was placed here, I was created here, I was born here, and I've lived here most of my life. So I think that's true of anywhere that you happen to be born and you happen to have lived and had your life experiences. So I think a lot of people would feel they live there and they've got a justification for living there because they were born there, quite rightly. And so too will Palestinians feel that, of course, as well. And of course, the Palestinians have got many issues. I'm going to come on to talk about that because that's a central part of the concern, of course. And it's impossible to give any sort of critique over 6 million people and how each of them are living their day-to-day lives. It's absolutely impossible to know on an individual level how they're all acting morally and whether they're keeping themselves in accordance to those commandments or not. But on a state level, of course, one can look collectively at how Israel itself, and Israel, strange enough, is based on a secular state, although that has changed quite a lot over the years. There's been a real big increase in the right-wing religious, in their influence over parliament. So that has been changing. Whether that means that they're more interested in the commandments and upholding them and making sure that they're in line with governmental policy and that they're held accountable to that, that's another issue, of course. But certainly there are serious issues in regard to the commandments and whether or not the government are actually upholding those. And I would say on many issues that they're perhaps not actually. And certainly in terms of how they acquired the land to begin with. I mean, if you look at the commandments not to steal, it leads you to ask, what is ownership? I mean, that's at the real crux of this issue, isn't it? Who owns that land? Of course, the Palestinians had lived there for some time. Nobody quite knows how long. But of course, they were made up of a number of people, different ages, who'd inherited the land from their forefathers, as tradition is. And they were connected to the Arabs who lived across the Arabian Peninsula more generally. And so there are disputed histories of how long they had been there for, but I don't really see it as that interesting or important to know how many centuries or millenniums even, or decades. Those people were living there. It was their ancestral land. They had made a life for themselves there. And what happened was that so many of them were forced to leave their homes and pushed aside and exiled from what was their homeland. And so if you look at the commandment of not to steal and also not to covet thy neighbour's goods, that's a direct contradiction of those laws. And the irony there of setting up a Jewish state by using the means of breaking one of the most sacred Jewish vows. I mean, the commandments, you can't get much more Jewish than that. I mean, if you're not looking at that as a fundamentally important part of the Jewish culture, then what is? Then nothing really is of any real great value to me, because that's a real central tenet of the Jewish faith, those 10 commandments. It really is, So I do think there's a real key issue with that in terms of the rights to the land, and that Palestinians exiled really had that land taken from them. And over the years, increasingly more land has been taken. We're probably all familiar with the map, but this map shows, if you look on the map, everything that's all in white, is the land of Israel. And everything in green is Palestinian. So you can see gradually Israel's grown as Palestine has shrunken really over the years, to the extent that really Palestine is left with just a small patch of land compared to what it was really. And Jerusalem is divided up. So you can see progressively over time how the land has changed and how the ownership has changed hands, and really what a minimal part that the Palestinians now have left over, and a smaller access to the land and to its resources therein. And so really the methods that they employed to take that land, really have been quite bad, and it really does seem like a theft in many ways. That can, of course, be changed, and I think the legitimacy, therefore, of Israel on the grounds of being a homeland and a return to that ancestral homeland is under jeopardy, and it to me is illegitimate until those concerns are addressed. It could easily be, or somehow be, legitimized or re-legitimized. But it's not just the commandment not to steal. The other one, not to murder, of course, is a central one too. And you look at all the lives that have been lost. Now, what is murder, of course, is of course a fundamental question. Taking an innocent life who's no threat to you, of course, would be our most logical and simplest definition. And of course, somebody who's sending grenades into your backyard, or killing or threatening to kill your neighbours or your family, they're not necessarily innocent. So, of course, in terms of warfare, there's a legitimate question to ask there. When is it right to defend yourself? What is a reasonable use of force? And when is it illegitimate? And when is there a over use of force? When are we using too much force? And I think if you look, there's countless examples over the years when people have been killed in taking down terrorists. Too often, innocent civilians are killed as well. And I've just heard conveyor belt stories of those over the years, just too many times, really. Too many innocent lives taken. And I accept that there are terrorists in the Palestinian communities that are responding to the awful conditions they've been in. And some people use terrible methods to retaliate. And so there were murders on both sides, and I accept the wrongs on both sides, and yet there were innocent participants on both sides, innocent civilians who actually just want to make peace and want everyone to live a better life, who are being swept into it and being targeted. And just to give some information, I was at a recent protest finding out information, and this is some information that they gave me. Since the start of the recent Gaza border protests, since March the 30th of last year, 2018, or 2 years ago actually, since then over 320 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip. Of the total fatalities, 216 were killed at the protests, including 44 children, 5 women, 2 journalists, 4 paramedics, and 8 people with disability, including a child. And over 33,000 have been wounded, including 7,000 children, 1,900 women, including paramedics and also journalists amongst those victims. So they're quite staggering numbers, and I think these protests over the last year or two have been at some of the worsening conditions that the Palestinians have been going through. And of those wounded, over 8,000 have been hit by live fire, 5,561 sustained limb injuries, and over 124 have had amputations, and that figure includes 21 children. So I don't know how accurate those figures are, but according to this leaflet, the sources giving that come from the UN, the UNRWA, I don't know who they are, the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the Commission of Inquiry Report 2019, update 12th of September 2019. So there were various sources, and another one, Al-Haq, H-A-Q. So I've never heard of them either, but there were a variety of sources that claim those were the numbers of the victims. But I mean, going back much further throughout the decades, there's been large numbers of victims, and there's also been victims on the other side, victims of Hamas, perhaps, or other terrorist atrocities, perhaps much smaller numbers, but there have also been suffering on the Israeli side. And of course, the Israelis still live under that fear and the threat of there being bombs or various terrorist activities. And so there is that kind of that fear of reprisals from angry Palestinians. There's a lot of angry Palestinians who don't retaliate to those extreme lengths, that channel their energy into other things, or try to find a way to understand or forgive or to protest in peaceful manners. But to go back to the point I was saying, really trying to be held accountable to the Ten Commandments is a really important thing, particularly and especially if your right to being somewhere is underpinned by a supposed claim of being promised that land by God, the very same God who gave Moses those 10 commandments. So it's a really important thing to have that. And I think, could that be addressed? Is there some way that could be that the state of Israel, which is viewed as illegitimate by many people, for that reason, in fact, because of their treatment of the Palestinians. But in fact, there are lots of other reasons that people view that. So if you look at, in terms of the religious ideology, Christians tend to be quite split down the middle, and I'm quite divided myself on it. Because on the one hand, I feel like I want to support Jewish people, and certainly I feel like the Mosaic commandments and all the other prophets, I feel like there's a great tradition there, and there's a great history of preserving the word of God and actually teaching people what it means to live a devout life and to be respectful of life. And I think there could be a whole really great thing about Israel being there within a world where there's so much conflict, where there's so much awful things going on, and that we so desperately need people to teach really good moral laws and to actually be there as a guiding light to actually support morality and uphold traditional values. Now more than ever, because there are just so many amoral and immoral things going on in the world. Perhaps there always were. But I certainly feel like in terms of their tradition that they certainly have had a right in the past. But I'm also too well aware that the Jews have had times when they've been very close to God and also very distant. And so it's been a very checkered history over the years of having a close relationship and of being chosen by God to be the lawgivers and teachers. And of course, coming with that comes great responsibility and the burden of responsibility, of course. But, I'm divided really because I also feel like, but it could also just be an excuse, couldn't it, really, to reclaim that land, to use Jewish people as an excuse just to take over that land and actually not to live in accordance to those commandments whatsoever. But merely just to use that as the pretense for taking over someone's land and to use that for occupation, colonialism, and really just using the resources and giving yourself a much higher and better quality of life than your neighbours. And not actually to be any sort of guiding light to the world, but to actual fact, to be a false light, in fact, pretending to be a guiding light, but in actual fact, not living a life that's any more higher or better than anyone else in the world, still at the same level as the rest of the world, involved and accused of mass murder and of war crimes and of theft. No real better than in any other country, really. I mean, I'm not saying Israel is any worse than other places, but there are accusations of murders and of thefts and of serious human rights violations in all different parts of the world, to be quite honest. And where you've got large populations of hundreds of millions of people, you're bound to expect that, because with large numbers of people comes large numbers of both good and bad deeds. So that's a logical conclusion of that. In any country, you're bound to find lots of good and lots of bad. But of course, we're going to look at Israel differently because it does make those claims, has made those claims of having its legitimacy based on the religious grounds, based on having that Jewish ancestry, which is based on Mosaic commandments. So if they're not held accountable to that, then really they are just a pretense, they are just a contradiction. So I'm not saying that they totally have broken all of those commandments all of the time, but I'm saying that certainly there have been serious errors in terms of taking innocent lives and loss of civilian lives, in taking land and exiling people from Palestine. And, that could be remedied. It would cost a lot. No one's saying it wouldn't. But offering at least some compensation to the people who had lost their homes and their ancestral land, offering them an adequate compensation or offering them the right to return. I mean, I think they're afraid of offering the right to return just because they feel like they could be swamped. There could be too many and they wouldn't be able to cope with them with the limited resources. But I think actually some research recently I read has shown that only a limited number of those exiled Palestinians would actually want to return if they were offered compensation instead. So I think they could be bought off with an adequate sum that would help them resettling in their new lives, in fact, and help them to improve the quality of lifestyle. And actually, in some ways, that would actually also change how they feel about Israel and also how the world feels about them too. Like if you break a glass and you pay for that glass, people tend to think less about what you've broken and more about what you've mended. So whenever you've done something wrong, you can always make up for it and should always make the effort to, So that's really important too. It's not about criticizing someone and saying how awful they are, what a deplorable situation it is. It's about recognizing the wrongs, because that's a good guide to how we can make things right. If we don't recognise there are problems, we can't start looking for those solutions to those problems. And there do seem to be a lot of problems in Palestine at the moment. It's not just those exiled wanting to return or wanting some recognition of what happened or some sort of due compensation for that. But there are lots of wrongs within Palestine or within the Palestinian territories going on today. And just to give you a brief overview of those, there's been lots of checkpoints that have been set up throughout the country, actually within the Palestinian territories themselves. And the result of this is that those checkpoints within the Palestinian territory, they are leading to really long delays, and this is making social and economic life much harder. And there are even long delays, reportedly, for emergency services, ambulances delayed getting to emergency responses. So that's obviously hindering people in really hard situations, accidents and emergencies. There's also occasional times when the rules are prohibiting certain people from travelling at all. I heard at one point, I heard a report that at one checkpoint, all males were refused entry on one day, which of course would lead to a lot of anger and frustration. You imagine if you had to wait several hours every day you're travelling to school or to work or to any social engagement. Every day you're having to have those hours and hours of delays. What kind of effect is that going to have on your social life, on your economic structure? And how does having all those checkpoints within the Palestinian territories, how does that actually prevent anyone from targeting Israel? I'm not quite sure of that. And there are lots of roadblocks, and these are causing long delays in transport, which is actually affecting the cost of things. So it's putting up the cost of both goods and resources, but it's also affecting people's access to healthcare. There are a lot of different issues, but one of the big ones, of course, is the wall, which has kind of recently been built and extended, of course, otherwise known to some, perhaps euphemistically, as the security fence. And the result of this is that it's fragmented Palestine into lots of smaller islands, cutting it off from each other. And also that lots of land has been put inside the Israeli territory, excluding it from the access to Palestinians. The actual wall is not always noticeable even from the Israeli side. Some parts of it you could drive by it and not even see that it was a giant wall, and it is absolutely huge. And in some parts it has an electric fence with razor wires. So it's really designed, like a prison to keep people out or keep people in, I suppose. And the wall is also built up close to Palestinian urban areas, which can cut it off from surrounding areas. And many farmers have reported there that they're cut off from their farmlands. So So there's real issues with that wall, and my major issue with that is that it cuts off Palestinians from Israelis and stops them engaging and meeting each other as much as they would and learning about each other's circumstances. And actually, that seems to be the only rational and real way that there's actually going to be any peace, like through dialogue and through learning to understand each other more. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot more increase in ignorance and people assuming things about each other without actually knowing, because it's through meeting people face to face that you actually get to overcome a lot of ignorance. So a giant wall is obviously going to increase the amount of ignorance and stop people meeting as much as they did. 40% of male Palestinians have been detained at some point. Seems quite a large figure, actually. But yeah, it's quite a large amount. But I don't know about the conditions of those and how they've been treated. But one thing that does concern me is that 10% of prisoners held in Israeli prisons are held as what's called administrative detainees. Now, this means that they can be held indefinitely without any kind of charge whatsoever. So that seems, if you compare that to other law standards, it seems quite wrong, doesn't it, really? At least if you are going to be held for a length of time, I would have thought you should have the right to a fair trial, should have the right to be given a charge. You are here in the UK, whether that's always kept or not. You have the right here to be given a charge, to be given your legal rights, to have legal representation, and to have some sort of trial in which to defend yourself, to have some sort of representation there. So it does seem to me quite wrong that should be, and that's another humanitarian concern, I think, there. So there's a whole sort of wealth of different issues there. And another issue that's come to light to my attention recently is this issue of the settlements. There's been a huge amount more of settlements being built on the Palestinian territory. And the Israeli government have kind of not done anything to stop that. In fact, in some cases, they've even been paying people money to actually move, giving them a financial incentive to move into these new areas. So it's like almost a calculated plan to sort of like set up increasing islands of Israeli population within the Palestinian territory. So, that seems to be part of their goal, increasingly just to take more and more of the land. And concerning more is that some of these people, in fact, are legally armed. They have the right to bear arms, where in fact it's illegal for Palestinians to carry a gun. Whereas many of the settlers are allowed to carry a gun and to arm themselves. Seems a total disparity in the law there, doesn't it? It reminds me of America back in the 50s, in Jim Crow laws, and during that time when black people there, they couldn't carry guns, and meanwhile there were a lot of racist white people who could carry guns, and that's pretty bad. Now everybody can carry guns there. I don't know if that's better, but it's probably better actually, but it's still too many guns. But that apartheid of like some people legislatively can carry guns and some people can't, that's bound to end in a really imbalanced and unfair situation, isn't it, really? How can someone armed with words and stones have an argument with someone who's armed with a gun? It seems really, really unfair, doesn't it, that? And when so it seems like there's a whole range of issues that people quite rightly are upset with Israel about. And I think it's fair to say that it's the government and the state of Israel that they're more upset with, actually, rather than Israeli citizens. And in fact, there's a huge number of Israeli citizens who are very concerned with their own government. There's lots of people who opt not to go to the military conscription. They choose to go to prison instead because they don't want to serve as part of an armed forces that could be killing many civilians and using a disproportionate use of violence. And there were lots of other Israelis that engage in peaceful protests and tried to help stand up for the Palestinians in a various variety of different ways. So there's a large number of Israelis that are pro-Palestinian rights and that do want to help them. And I actually think that is the sane decision, actually. Because actually it's in Israeli citizens' own self-interests to want their neighbours to actually live a reasonably content lifestyle where they've got a reasonably good standard of life and not feeling frustrated, bitter and angry and resentful at them for most of the time, which is going to lead to, even if it's only a small minority, becoming terrorists and targeting them. You know, you're going to minimize those risks considerably if you've made every effort to protect, to help, and to nourish your neighbours and to help make sure that they do have access to the basic resources